Time to say a very good morning to Helen Dale. Helen, welcome back. How are you?
Not too bad. How are you, Mike?
Not bad at all. Thank you very much indeed. The tier system still seems to be operational. I assume, I think you're in a tier 2 scenario, aren't you?
I am in tier 2, yes.
So you are able to go to the pub if you so wish.
My partner and I went to the pub, yes.
Excellent.
But we didn't book, so we had to sit outside, and it was
really?
very cold.
Yeah, you see, I'm told that's going on in quite a lot of places, and people have been quite strict about the substantial meal stuff and all of that that's going on, and it really is terrible for people who are trying to run a business and trying to be successful in life. You know, it's costing them an absolute fortune.
We're also going to a restaurant this evening, but we did the right thing this time, and we've booked in advance.
Right. Well, good.
So we're going to be sitting inside and not freezing.
Well, thank goodness for that. I mean, it is quite important. I actually believe very firmly in this, that it's important, if you can do it, to go and do it, because it does actually, I mean, I've been out, I think, a couple of times this week into restaurants with people, because it kind of refreshes your faith in society and your faith in people. Because otherwise, if you sit at home and you don't go out, you just become more and more isolated and less human, I think.
Well, yes, this is the lockdown suits certain personalities, introverted personalities who do prefer to the quiet life, basically. But even for very introverted people, a friend of mine in Australia is very introverted, but even she said no. Because if I do have to go out, because Australia's all of it's out of lockdown now, even Victoria, it's fine. It's just gone back to normal.
Right.
And she was in Victoria and she said, no, I am very deliberately once a week going out to a restaurant with friends or to the pub or whatever. And she said, I'm doing that precisely because if, as an introverted person, if she doesn't socialise, then she finishes up isolated and just not talking to anyone except the cat, basically, or to her husband or to her kids. And it's not that she doesn't love her husband or her kids, but the point is there is more to a social life than just your immediate family, and she's very conscious of that.
No, absolutely right. Well, let's get to the main reason for our chat today, which is a book review that you did with one of Jordan Peterson's books, 12 Rules for Life. Jordan Peterson, of course, I think since you've done this book review, has been offered and then had it rescinded a professorship at Cambridge University. So talk us through, first of all, the book and what you said about it.
Well, what happened was last year, I mean, I write a lot of book reviews. People are always sending me books opportunistically to try to get me to write book reviews. And the it probably was actually 2018, realistically, I was sent two. I was sent Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, and I was sent Amy Alcon's Unfology. Now, I can't say the name of the book properly because it will mean the pressing of the big red button.
That's right, exactly.
But they're both self-help books. Now, I had only ever read one self-help book in my life, and that was Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, which was written decades ago. Right. And I didn't read it because I picked it off the shelves or bought it in a bookshop. It was recommended to me by my pupil master when I was doing my pupillage, which is the training year that you do in a set of chambers before you go to the bar. Right. And he thought it was good, sound advice for someone who's going to go into legal practice. And it was very good advice. I'd never read self-help before, and I really did not want to read these two books, and I put it off and I put it off and I put it off. And eventually Standpoint magazine wrote to me, because this was just at the period, because we're going back a few years now, where Jordan Peterson was starting to become really controversial. And Amy Alcon, independently, who's mainly known as a comedian in the United States, was also becoming quite well known. And
I mean, I've always struggled with the idea that Jordan Peterson is controversial, to be honest. I mean, which is obviously off on a side tangent. But I mean, there is really nothing that he says which is in any way, in my view, difficult to comprehend or difficult to disagree with.
Well, this is right. And this is exactly what I found when I read both books. I read his book and I read the Amy Alcon book, and Standpoint approached me and wanted me to write something about Jordan Peterson. And I had a bit of back and forth with the editor, and I said, well, okay, I'll read these two books. And I read them, and a little bit more back and forth. And I finished up having to look in the mirror a bit, because I'd always been very dismissive of self-help. And I remember having this conversation with my pupil master, God rest him, he's dead now. He was later booted upstairs to the Supreme Court and Justice Dewdney in Australia, Dewdney QC. And I remember having this conversation over the Dale Carnegie, why do I need to read self-help? And his comment to me, he says, Helen, you've got a very sharp tongue. And he says, you really don't want to do that to the judge.
Yes.
And this is a good book that will help to discipline that sharp tongue so you use it at the right time. And he was right. And so when I read Alcon and Peterson's book, I got the very strong sense it wasn't telling me anything, exactly like you're saying. It wasn't telling me anything I didn't already know. Right. But I then realised, because then just as as I filed for Standpoint, the piece, the pronoun controversy and all of the other things just blew up all over Jordan Peterson, and he just became this global phenomenon at exactly that point. And I'd filed and the piece was published and so on and so forth. And I tried to address why people would need to read Jordan Peterson and Amy Alcon. Now, this was before his health problems that he's had subsequently. Yeah. It was kind of in the middle of the sort of initial controversy about him, because I wrote it so long ago. And it was sort of before he became this lightning rod. It's about the only way you can describe it, this lightning rod for sort of the culture wars. And so I tried to be very measured and tried to say, well, why do some people need self-help? And I then had to go back to my early legal experience in Australia, where I had seen what had happened to families where you effectively get kids who've been raised by wolves. And that's the only way I can describe it. Yeah. They've just not been taught any of the most basic things about how to comport themselves in the world. And all the sort of like really trivial stuff I can understand now why the job centre has to run courses on this kind of thing. People who don't know how to dress smartly when they go to a job interview. Right. People who young men especially, who don't know to put deodorant on. Yes. People of both sexes, and Jordan Peterson covers this very well in 12 Rules for Life, who don't know how to behave around animals. Stuff like that. And
does he contend that this is a failing of the parents or the failing of society, or what does he say?
He doesn't really sort of go into that blame game. That's not his thing, and it's not Amy Alcon's thing either. What they both try to do is to set out very sound basic advice for how to live your life, and then they try to explain why they think their advice works. And they use slightly different methods, although they do actually call on some of the same scientific research. So Jordan Peterson's very big on fables and stories, and he doesn't just use Bible stories. He's got this reputation for just using Bible stories, but he doesn't. He uses lots of classical ones, so stuff from the Greeks and the Romans.
Aesop's fables, that kind of thing.
Aesop's fables and all of that kind of, and there's stuff from in his writing from like China and India and Japan, and he tries to make this argument, and it ultimately comes from Carl Jung, that the reason you keep getting these repeated ideas about the way to live your life and life advice from sort of the old sages that go back thousands of years is because human beings are the same everywhere, even though our cultures are different. Yeah. And we have developed the same body of common wisdom about how to approach the world. Now, in Carl Jung, it's called archetype theory. We all have archetypes in our heads that are shared amongst human beings, but with minor variations across different cultures, but they all have the same basic message. Now, a lot of people really, really dislike this argument because it suggests that, novelists and creative people and writers don't have full control over the way they tell a story to the world. But unfortunately, I get to put my hand up, and I've had 3 novels published. I'm in the middle of writing a 4th, and the first 3 were very successful. And one of the things that you learn as a novelist is that if you try to tell a story in a way that doesn't fit in, at least in some small way, with fairly conventional narrative structures, it just won't sell.
So you mean people expect a story to unfold in a particular way?
Yes.
Right.
They do. And if you can do that and write it well, then you finish up selling a lot more copies, basically. Right. It's really that simple. And it's also why authors like Tolkien and J.K. Rowling are so immensely popular, because they plug into those archetypes that Jordan Peterson is writing about.
And I suppose that would also feed into people that make films as well, because there's nothing more annoying, I think, for a lot of people. I'm not sure I'm necessarily one of them, but to watch a movie and then to have it have a really useless ending, and you kind of go, the ending was terrible, and then from that moment on, you can't even think about watching it again.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And it is interesting that George Lucas, and I'm going to get the names wrong, but the 3 original Star Wars films from the 70s and 80s, now he very deliberately made use of exactly the same archetype theory as Jordan Peterson, but he got it from a chap called Joseph Campbell, who was kind of Jordan Peterson, but 50 years ago kind of thing. Right. And he wrote a book called Hero with 1,000 Faces. And he does the same sort of thing as Jordan Peterson, but he doesn't turn it to self-help. Right. He turns it to narrative structure. So you read Joseph Campbell if you're interested in putting a novel together, basically, or writing a script.
Yeah. Well, Spielberg's the same, isn't it? I mean, anything that Spielberg is involved with, whether he's a producer, whether he's a director, you just know that it's going to be a fantastic kind of, creation, which is going to have a start and a middle and an end. And you know,
exactly.
There might be, some great action scenes, or there might not be. But everything that he's ever done has always had that structure.
Yes, and when he calls upon other people's writing, like most famously for Schindler's List, the film, it was based on the novel Schindler's Ark by Thomas Keneally, which won the Booker Prize back in the 80s. And he's an Australian novelist. And there's a fairly serious case to be made that Schindler's Ark, the novel, is probably the best fictionalized treatment of the Holocaust ever written.
Right.
It's
a fabulous movie as well.
It's incredibly well structured. But what Spielberg does is he follows Keneally's plot structure to the letter. And Keneally in Australia is obviously Schindler's List, they rebadged the book and brought it out again because of the film. Yeah. And it made Thomas Keneally a disgusting, ridiculously wealthy man because the book sold all over the world.
Disgustingly wealthy is fine, you can say that.
But the thing is, it is a very good book. I did it for my English A-level in Australia, and it is a very, very good book and very well structured. And for all that it's based on a true story, and Keneally did a lot of research to make sure that he got it right, it's also plotted perfectly. Everything is perfect, and you're just guided into the structure of the story, and it's totally compelling. And even though it's like 600 pages long, I remember when I read it in high school, I was sort of up for 3 days and hardly went to bed because I had to finish this rotten book.
I know. It's incredibly emotional and emotionally draining as well. I watched it with one of my sons for the first time for him a while ago. He's 16. And it's hard to break through a 16-year-old boy's kind of psyche quite often. But he was really bowled over by it, because that's the effect it has on you at the end, And
I recommend the book to your son as well.
Yeah, I will. Yeah.
If he's anything like I was as a teenager, he will respond to it in exactly the same way. It's very impressively done.
Funnily enough, I talk about my father quite a lot on this show. He used to say to me when I was about 12 or 13, that he wished that humans did what bears did. I never found out whether bears actually did this, but he said basically what they do is they come out of the cave when the kids, when the baby bears get to be about the equivalent of 12 or 13, they hit them on the head and knock them out and then run away. And basically when the baby bears wake up, they have to learn how to fend for themselves. And that was his kind of view of how he should be bringing me up. And I was like, okay, so he wanted me to be self-sufficient, self-regarding, able to look after myself.
Well, yes, and this gets back to the Jordan Peterson point about trying to encourage people to be more resilient. Yeah. And the thing is, if you haven't been brought up to be resilient, or you haven't been brought up with any rules at all, Jordan Peterson is a boon. But the problem you've got now, and this is why the piece has become talked about again, is I was approached by another outlet, several other outlets, can you write something on Jordan Peterson? And I said, I already have, and I haven't changed my view. Here's the Standpoint piece. And so what Reaction did, that's the name of an online magazine, it's not a print magazine like Standpoint, and it's just called Reaction, and you can just go to their website, and it's run by Ian Martin, who writes for The Times. Yeah. And I said, I'll give you the standpoint piece. I'm not going to charge you anything for it because I haven't changed my views. I don't want to be a crank the handle columnist and just basically paraphrase myself from 18 months ago, or 2 years ago it is nearly now. So here you are. And they, to their credit, they reran it, and I wrote a little introduction for it, explaining the history that I gave you at the beginning of our chat. And just sort of, and also just to point out that people need to stop trying to review authors, and they need to review their books.
Yes.
And because that's what I'd actually done. I took a lot of care to review the actual
and that's
book
interesting,
and not
isn't it?
Jordan Peterson.
That's an interesting point, because unfortunately, like everything else in this now world in which we live, people are judged on, what they say, what they think, as opposed to the actual thing that they've done, the creation that they have made, the book that they've published, or the speech that they've made, or whatever it is that they're doing. They're judged solely, basically, on what they've said before.
Yes, and and this will key into the next point. The thing that is thrown at Jordan Peterson a lot now is that he wrote this book of self-help that became enormously popular, sold millions of copies, and then failed to live up to his own advice. As I think and people were tweeting this at me after the reaction piece ran, and I pointed out I wrote the piece originally before there was any of this controversy. It talks about J.K. Rowling a lot, the piece does, and it was before J.K. Rowling put herself on the wrong side of the transgender debate, all of that. But the comments that people were making to me was he couldn't follow his own advice. He became addicted to benzodiazepines. So they're quite a serious...
Yes. Although, I mean, I think in his case, he probably had mitigating circumstances that most people would understand, because he did become this kind of overnight phenomenon, didn't he?
Yes, he did. And he was this sort of fairly obscure, well, not fairly obscure, but he was a Canadian university academic. And whilst he's been very, very well educated, been taught at Harvard and all of this kind of thing, he was certainly not known outside of his university department, the psychology and psychiatry.
Well, he's basically an academic. Was he not really prepared for the mass media and the incredible kind? I mean, people were queuing up around the block to go and see him, weren't they?
Oh, it was more than queuing up round the block. It was absolutely extraordinary. He was being treated like a rock star.
Yeah.
I mean, you saw photographs and video footage of outside his presentations that he would do, and it looked like a Rolling Stones concert.
I know, incredible.
It was just extraordinary, and it was for this sort of for this university academic basically getting up to do the equivalent of what he taught his students when they were doing their psychology or psychiatry qualifications. He was getting up, but to do this in the Apollo.
Right.
I think that's where he was in London. Actually, he was in the Apollo.
He was,
and he
I think he did a couple of nights there. I mean, it was like a sort of, as you say, it was like a rock tour,
a rock concert.
But extraordinary times, yeah. So, I mean, in conclusion, because we're almost out of time, believe it or not, Helen, let's talk a little bit about the Sky News situation, because we will be talking about it coming up later in the show. But I just wanted to get your take on it, really.
Well, we've got a worse version of the Jordan Peterson problem, but it is the same sort of issue. Where you've got individuals who are very, very fond of handing out advice and telling other people how to live, and then not following their own rules, basically, not being able to live up to it themselves. And I'm always put in mind of my father told me when I was a little girl, very sound advice: don't tell other people to do it if you can't do it yourself.
Right. Pretty straightforward.
It will come back and bite you. And of course, in the context of all these with coronavirus regulations, you have to remember, yes, the regulations are very silly and petty. We've talked about this multiple times on your show. Yes, you can understand why people breach them. Yes, it was worse when it was Neil Ferguson, Dominic Cummings and Catherine Calderwood, because they were from the state. So these were the people who were making and wanting those rules enforced. So it is worse when they break the rules, because they have the coercive power of the state behind them. But I just think if you can't do it yourself, you must not tell other people to do it, because if you do get caught, and if it does turn out that those coronavirus regulations were necessary, I don't think it will, but if it does turn out that those kind of regulations about the hospitality industry were necessary, then we're in a real mess, because you finish up with public figures, the elites, the people who are supposed to know better than the rest of us, completely letting the side down. So then the average person in the street just says, well, if they don't have to do it, why should I?
Well, exactly right. Helen, great to talk to you again. Thank you very much indeed. The time is really flying on the show today. Speak to you again next week. Thank you very much indeed. Helen Dale there giving us pretty straightforward advice there. If you can't do it yourself, don't tell anybody else to do it. It's that simple. We don't lecture you here at Talk Radio. Adam Bolton has written a piece for The Guardian, or done an interview with The Guardian, in which he said that Sky News' credibility is at stake because of what Kay Burley and Beth Rigby and others have done. Well, I think their credibility's been at stake for a while, Adam. I've got some news for you.